welcome. We're really, really happy to have you here. My name is Serena, and I will be here with you today. I will be introducing Johanna and the panel speakers today later, and then also be facilitating the networking session, which will start in about an hour. We will also explain the tool at that session. What I do want to say before I introduce Johanna and Sophie and Carl Yo is that even though this is going to be a panel discussion, there's going to be time for open questions from the audience. So down here, I believe, is Slido. Put your questions in there and we will be able to see that, myself and Johanna, and we, at the end of the session, will be able to ask or at least convey the questions to Sophie and Carl Yo. And so, as you know, because you signed up for this session or joined it, this is specifically a chat about internationalization, scaling, and IPOing, if that's a word. But so Johanna, who is going to be the facilitator, and I will introduce her in a bit, is she's going to have an interview or discussion with Sophie Ferrer, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lisa, and Carl Yo Salen, who is the founder of Locafox, but he's also heading up the Europe leg for Sezzle, and they have been involved either internationalizing from Europe to the US or from the US to Europe, and then also, IPOing. So quickly, Johanna is going to introduce Sophie and Carl Yo, but I'm happy to introduce Johanna. Johanna, as most of you will know, because she's been part of all of our programs for such a long time, is a mentor at our programs and a consultant. She has spent the first part of her career in investment banking, providing strategic advice on mergers and acquisitions, IPOs, that's why we have her here for this big discussion, and other capital raising with a particular focus on media, telecom, and technology. She now has a portfolio of activities in the startup world, including working with us here at Metro, sitting on the board of 3 software tech businesses at various stages of scaling. She is the chairperson of QStory in the UK. She's a non-executive director at Web Financial Group in Spain, and also Hive Online in Denmark. She is a venture partner at the ATI Boeing Accelerator in London, and she's an angel investor with more than 40 early stage companies. Johanna, thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to this session and the questions that you will be asking these 2 very impressive people on the screen that I see now. So over to you. I'll be listening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Serena. Can you hear us?
Yes, perfect.
Yep.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Firstly, I wanted to welcome you all. We hope that you'll find this session useful. I think our panelists have got amazing insights from both what they currently do and what they've done before that, which I'm hoping they can distill into some wisdom that you can take away. So let me start by introducing them. Carl Yo Salen has got 11 years of experience in building international tech companies. He's currently the managing director at Sezzle, which I met as part of the Metro Target program, which unusually for me, working in an accelerator program, was in the middle of going public, which was odd but wonderful. And they have been doing financing and buy now, pay later solutions out of the US, and are now bringing that to Europe, which is what he's helping them to do. But previously, he has a number of other very interesting experiences scaling companies across 13 markets on 4 continents. Among other roles, he was a managing director at Groupon, at Rocket Internet, and at Locafox. So I think he's going to have a lot to share as we go through some of the key elements of scaling. Also joining me is Sophie, when I met her, Smethman, and now Freya. She's the co-founder and CEO at Lisa. We also met at Metro, one of the earliest accelerators I had joined, when she was in the early stages of dreaming up this business. She's always been very passionate about human-centered approach to leveraging innovation in tech for retail. And I think that emerged out of her broad experience, but particularly in her 10 years working in big box retail for Metro, where her last role was innovation manager. I think lots of people talk about businesses being beneficiaries of this very difficult period that we're all going through. But I think Sophie bringing live stream shopping, I think has had an opportunity to at least have a very large captive audience, and a lot of retailers desperate to find ways to make those a more interesting experiences. So I'm sure she's going to have a lot of interesting things to share. Maybe we could start by each of you just spending 2 or 3 minutes saying sort of where your business is on scaling, and what do you think the next phase is going to be about? Maybe Sophie, you'd like to start.
Sure. Thanks so much, Joanna. Yeah, so actually, as you just mentioned, COVID has had quite a impact on our business in the sense that, as I like to say, basically it seems like retail has awakened out of this beauty sleep in Europe and the US when it comes to their e-commerce businesses and online customer experiences. Can you still hear me? Just checking, because your picture's a bit... Okay, great. Your picture's a bit choppy on my end, so just... And it's interesting because in China, actually, I just got the latest figures, 17% of all e-commerce is already done via live streaming. So, why are we this far behind? And that really never made sense to us. We were so sure this would hit eventually. But it has taken quite some time. And then indeed, sort of March this year, we had launched our MVP last year, tested with 2 big customers. We joined the accelerator program beginning of the year. And then in March, everything went into lockdown. There was like total silence. Everyone was in shock. And then within 2 weeks, basically everything flipped. And within this year, we've grown from 2 active customers to 17 active big enterprise customers in 5 countries. So that's been quite
wonderful.
Quite a productive lockdown.
Okay. Maybe you could just add one thing on what are you going to focus on in this next phase to build on the 17?
So
sort of scaling priorities.
Something I think we'll talk a little bit later about is the fact that scaling has become possible entirely digitally. So we're already in 5 countries now. We're probably going to be in 7 countries by end of the year. And given the infrastructure we have and the way we work, we won't actually have really international barriers to entry anymore. So our focus for next year will be more on sort of distilling out what has made live shopping successful with customers this year, with all the different ranges of customers we've tested, piloted with, and gone live with. What's the key success factors, and how can we translate that into a sales strategy for next year to really proactively expand and further scale the business.
Thank you. Kalya, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Sezzle and what you're planning to do.
Sure. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. So Sezzle is a company that is now 4 years old, has around 20,000 merchants in the portfolio, around 3.8 million users. It IPO'd last year, as already mentioned. It then expanded in 2019 into Canada very successfully, and recently into India. And the next step that we are looking into is Europe, right? What is Sezzle? Sezzle is an alternative payment platform that is focused on the buy now, pay later sector. So the core service is essentially offering interest-free installment services for online users. There are a range of other services around that. Unfortunately, I can't talk a lot about our expansion strategy in Europe. I'm the managing director of Sezzle Europe, as you already mentioned, Joanna, and in charge of rolling it out here in Europe. But because we are a public company, I can't give you more information than the information that is public, right? Otherwise, I would share inside information. So I'm going to talk more about my past experience, which I do believe is more applicable to the people listening in, because Sezzle is a very specific beast, right? It's a FinTech company in a highly regulated market. And the experiences which I had in other companies, I think might be more interesting to dive into.
Okay, wonderful. Maybe we could start with how you set out. What are your thoughts on setting out an expansion strategy, whether that's driven by sales, marketing, partnerships,
sure,
product-led, whatever? I mean, I hear everything, so it's more about how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think you probably even have to take a step back, right, and think about what's the high-level strategy that you want to use for expansion, right? Or scaling. And scaling for me means always in that context, internationalizing. And I think you have always these two very strong different poles, right? The one pole being the very controlled product market fit approach, right? Another pole being the super hyper aggressive blitzscaling approach. And I was doing both, right? With Locafox, we did the very controlled product market fit approach, and with Rocket, I used to do the blitzscaling approach. And just to clarify what this means, right? So the product market fit is essentially the idea that you say, okay, I have a product or service working in one market, and I want to now move into the next market with my bread and butter business, and I want to validate this, right? I want to validate in the most efficient way that this service is also kind of satisfying the needs and demands of the consumers in the new market. And efficiency really means that you're trying to keep the cost as low as possible, right? It's all about having a small burn rate and increasing runway, and really, focusing on hitting this product market fit before you scale. And that's very interesting for companies that don't have a lot of cash, for companies that move into new markets, into nascent markets, blue ocean kind of markets, right, where they have a first move advantage or there's no real competition, or companies that have a very strong competitive advantage, technology-wise, or any other type of advantage, which is very hard to copy, right? So that's kind of the companies that should look at that approach. But then you have the other extreme, and that extreme is the aggressive blitzscaling approach, right? Which is kind of the Rocket way, where you essentially sacrifice efficiency for speed. And unlike the PMF approach, it's not about increasing your runway or scaling after you hit PMF. It's about scaling as fast as possible into as many markets as possible, right? Generating as much growth as possible. And here you have a very high gain, high risk strategy, right? Where if you win, then you become the biggest and most dominant player and attract a lot of capital and talent and so on. If you lose, the costs are very, very high. And I think you always have to approach it from that perspective, right? This blitzscaling strategy is for companies which have a lot of money, access to capital, which need to have a speed to market situation, have very strong competitors, and they need to move fast, and which really don't have a clear USP, right? So it's about out-executing your competition. So every startup has to first think about these two poles and then see in what range or how they balance these two. And only once they understood that, then you think about the more execution-driven steps, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Sophie?
Well, for us, it's been an interesting journey. I think so last year we launched our MVP of the live stream shopping software plugin, Lisa, that we have now, which enables live shopping in e-commerce. And I mean, at the time, even though in China this was already huge, in Europe, if you went and spoke to people about live shopping or live commerce, I mean, we were at OMR last year, for example, in May, we just launched the MVP. Literally no one knew what we were talking about. And this is last year, May, right? And it's like, oh, so doing something with VR in retail? No, live commerce, like just using live streams, make them shoppable, make them very fun and engaging, and sell off of them. So we had to, just by the nature of what it was, even though it's so simple to explain, there was still this huge education piece that had to be done last year. So we decided it was really critical to be highly efficient, cost efficient, that we build a very simple MVP, which already conveys in terms of user experience how awesome, let's say, and how well this kind of format can work. But it was always the product strategy to not be dependent on integrations, for example, into retail, so that retailers could test really quickly and lightly and discover whether this format works for them. And it was always part of the strategy not to be dependent. Doesn't mean it can't make sense, but not to be dependent on partnerships, for example, with agencies for sales, or are dependent on partnerships with e-com platforms and therefore needing APIs to scale. All of that might make sense in sort of phase 2 and phase 3 for growth, but in phase 1 that we're kind of getting out of now, it was really important for us to be independent, light and flexible and efficient, to discover and learn with the product, and really only to develop the product and add on to it when we saw that across a bigger range of customers, there was really a need for a new feature that would actually add value for, as we call it, the sort of highest common denominator approach only then would it actually be added as a feature. And I think that's kept us nimble. And that's sort of keeping it simple and focused has also sort of set us up for this sudden growth that has now come. Otherwise, if we would have been too complex, not flexible, we would never have been able to stem the growth that we've had in the last month. So first, it was indeed educating the market last year with the MVP. So we went to as many fairs as we possibly could just to get our name out there and to tell people about what live commerce is, entered competitions, these kind of things. Then end of the year, we focused on strategic partnerships. So we joined the Founders Factory Accelerator in London and partnered with L'Oreal just to get the name and again, the sort of the idea of live shopping out there. And then now in phase 3, it's really about the product strategy and how to design the product for even faster international scaling.
Thank you. I think one of the things that was interesting for me in your, as you described product strategy, was having the discipline to only innovate the product further when there was consensus that there was a reason to do that. And I think it echoes something that Olaf said in his session about you really need to focus to be meaningful. And I see often people getting distracted by lots of requests for lots of things that are interesting. But I think that discipline takes a lot of courage when you have clients wanting things. And I think it pays off if you can be disciplined about doing it. So
it's saying no as always the hardest thing, especially, I mean, we're a small, tiny little startup, growing, but still small, catering to the big enterprises of this world. And, the usual habit is, here's my wish list of 20 features I'd like to have. And it's like, yeah, well, maybe let's start with the simplest form and then discover together what your users actually want. And finding a balance between not really saying no and sort of helping your customers, the retailers, the e-commerce players, to learn what actually works with their audience and what users actually want is negotiating that, let's say, is probably one of the hardest things to do. Yeah, for sure.
One of my other questions is how have you, and maybe Kalya, we should start with you. How do you think of product development in terms of technical product development? How good does it have to be at each stage? Because I think there's as you try to sell into larger corporates, and Sophie, you're doing some of that too, is the desire for sort of enterprise grade type infrastructure is quite difficult at the beginning for startups. And sometimes it's a gating item, sometimes it's not. And so I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about that and how you sort of manage that as you grow your business.
Yeah, so it depends a little bit what your business model is, right? I think there's a big difference between enterprise business models or consumer business models or SMB business models. But in general, the way we tackle that is, it's really about first entering a new market with your core product. You might customize it to the point that it is necessary, but you don't really start innovating until you hit this product market fit, right? And it's really about understanding when you achieve product market fit. You really need to understand what are the KPIs, the proof that you have now validated this market, right? Once you reach this point, then you can start to innovate and really customize according to the local specific needs of the specific market. But it's very, very hard to jump into a market and innovate from the outset, because innovation always goes through the same cycles, right? We talked about MVPs. You have only so many bullets in your gun, right? You can only do so many cycles. So better you stick to what you know. And once you crack the market, then you really, you do the rest 20% of really understanding what's different here. How do you improve the last 10, 20, 15%? So I think that's the approach that we are choosing. But again, it also depends on the strategy. This is something which you have to afford. Sometimes people don't have the runway to do that. So it depends a little bit on your go-to-market strategy and the cash that you have available, really.
Yeah.
And well, from my side, I think I already talked a bit about our product strategy, but also looking into the future. This balance between customization possibilities for our customers and keeping it as out of the box as possible, and this sort of highest common denominator approach is something that we very much believe in and want to keep, because it's, in our opinion, the key to being scalable. as much as Carl just said, the further you move into the highly customized area of things and integrated, the more individual solutions you have for each customer at some point. So we're really trying to stick in that sweet spot, everybody to learn together. And if we do customized features, then to see whether those would also add value to others, and to keep going like that as long as it's possible.
I also think, to add on that notion here, is, again, if you are a bigger company, I think it's always very important to also think about product in terms of how you set up your team structure. And if you, for example, again, reference Rocket, right? If you would go into new regions, I think it's very advisable that you set up a dedicated product team within the region that is under the existing tech stack, right? So it shouldn't be a silo by itself, because that never really works. But you should be not dependent on the prioritization within the HQ, wherever it sits, right? Because what's always going to happen, you're always going to be, you can't plan, because there might be other priorities which are not important for your market, but more important for the group as a whole, right? So having a separate dedicated team that works under the existing tech stack is, I think, extremely important to really build the features necessary to move fast and enter markets fast in internationalization.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe just a person if people can't afford a team at the initial stage, but yes. Could we talk a little bit about customers and how you go about it? Because often innovation starts where you get a POC or a project, but that's not the same as signing up a full enterprise license and getting through procurement and all the joys that brings. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences and some of the pitfalls and how to avoid them?
Who would you like to start?
Maybe start with an example if that makes it easy.
Okay. No, I was thinking, who of us do you want to start? I'll just jump in. Again, for us, this is still, let's say, relatively early phase, even though we've grown so much this year. We've gone through that sort of growth cycle and different stages of growth so quickly that we're only just sort of stopping. Like, I think we now had, Cyber Monday, Black Friday, and we have Christmas business coming up. And since we're a retail tech startup, it means that we're completely tied to the cycles of our customers. So we're only just getting into a sort of, okay, 2 more weeks, then Christmas business will be through. And then, we'll have some time to actually reflect on what our sales funnel looks like and whether we're managing it efficiently, all these kind of things. But I think from the very beginning, and this is almost more a company culture thing, how do you want to work with customers, and how do you want to, when you're talking to them the first time, how well informed are you? And one thing that with our sales team we do quite regularly is that rather than doing like the typical demo session where every customer gets to see the exact same 2 or 3 things, we start these sessions more as interviews where we really try to find out from them, why are they interested in doing live shopping? Because there are many different reasons for brands or retailers to look into the space. Some of them are much more interested in top of the funnel sort of community building and engagement. Others are much more interested in actually driving and pushing sales as much as possible. So really depends what they're trying to do with this new format, this new experience. And then we basically cater the pitch, if you will, or even if it's just a demo, we just try to cater the conversation a bit more to what we've learned that they actually want to do with it. And that has proven to be quite effective because they feel like, we're listening to them. And then the second step, we also really try to learn what skills and infrastructure the retailer or the enterprise already has to support live commerce. So it's something we try to navigate as early as possible in the sales discussions to get a sense of, how quickly will they be able to flip the switch to make this format work for them, or will they be a customer that will need more support from our side? So we try to sort of categorize and cluster that at the beginning already. And other than that, key lesson from COVID is a strong online presence, which we definitely need to rebuild our website. And a great SEO ranking, because that's the way people find startups today, and there's really no other way.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, no matter what company I build, and if we talk about customer acquisition, there was 2 things which were, at least in every company, very helpful for me. The first thing is every time you start a new market, right? You need to understand the customer acquisition funnel. And we very much use a lot of established frameworks. And the one which we use the most is the Pirate framework of Dave McClure. It's called the R framework. I mean, probably everybody knows, or most people know it. And it's a super nice framework because it goes through the entire funnel, right? It starts from awareness. You understand how many people you can reach, and then acquisition, how many people come to your website, how many people then convert, right? How many people then pay, and how many people who pay then essentially refer you to more customers, right? So awareness, acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral. Hence R, right? And that's for us really useful because you always have the situation that this funnel is somewhere broken in different markets because you have different kind of customers, right? And we always start with that to see where the problem lies, right? Sometimes, we get to activation, the conversion is really good to sign up, but they don't pay. So, okay, maybe our pricing is broken, right? Or sometimes realize that, the problem lies early in the funnel. We have a lot of awareness, but, not a lot of people come to the website. So the marketing campaign doesn't work, right? So I think this is one thing which I really urge a lot of people to look at, and it also focuses you in terms of KPIs, right? Because I see very often, I'm a mentor now for I don't know how many years, and I see too many startups looking at too many KPIs, right? It's all less is more, right? It's always this focus, and these frameworks really help you to set the right focus. So that's maybe one thing which is kind of my biggest learning in terms of customer acquisition. And the second thing is also, which I see very often, and also I need to remind myself to do it more, is too many founders are too distant from their customers, right? It's this constant customer feedback, right? You have certain departments in your company like customer service, like sales, who have constant exchange with real customers. And really understanding what's going on there is very important. There needs to be customer feedback loops between those departments and the rest of the company, especially product, right? But also the management. I really like companies which put the management into the customer service for a week to just talk to customers.
Me too.
Because I think it's extremely helpful to understand the customer, but also understand what customer service actually is doing. And for example, we have a Slack channel where every review that is published about a Sezzle is being automatically published to the entire company, right? And we use a lot of customer feedback for the all hands and town halls and so on. And I think especially in the beginning, once you enter a new market, this is so important. And it's difficult. Even for me now, it's difficult. I don't do it enough, right? Because you have so much to do. But you really should do that every time you enter a new market because customer needs and desire is always different, right? And the nuances is what counts, right? What makes the difference. So I guess these are my two biggest recommendations in terms of customer acquisition.
Very helpful. Could I just ask one follow-up question? It sounded like your description of your funnel was a B2C funnel, but I presume it equally applies to B2B, but if it doesn't, maybe you could sort of explain a little more.
Yeah, I think it equally applies to also B2B. I think the better model is than the Pirate funnel. I forgot the name, to be honest. It was another one, which doesn't come to my mind now. But essentially, it's always the same, right? It leads you the steps, no matter if you acquire businesses or consumers, are very similar, right? You need to understand how to acquire them. Is it scalable? How much does it cost, right? Are they converting? Are they using? Are they paying? I think the paying is often the most important thing. I'm also a big advocate of having frameworks which force you to go into the payment questions very early. There's too many startups which kind of delay the payment portion, right? They say like, yeah, let's scale, right? And we're going to charge them later once they really need us. But if you give somebody a half-empty can of Coke, he might take it, right? If you suddenly tell him, hey, listen, now you have to pay me €1 for it, he might not take it, So going very early in with even maybe price which is slightly too high and work your way down, in my opinion, is much more useful than doing the opposite. But there are certainly other models, and I can send them into the group, but I don't have them in my head in the moment.
Thank you. Just as a reminder to our audience, we are going to keep time at the end for Q&A. So if you start to have questions, please drop them into the chat, hopefully at the bottom of your screen. I have a couple that have showed up already, but feel free to add them and we'll get to them soon. Could you talk next about people. Firstly, about your hiring plans as you expand, how you prioritize which roles, how you think about it, what works, what doesn't, and what you've learned. And maybe, Kalya, you'd like to start?
Sure. So I think, what I learned, for example, now with Sezzle, and I think this might also count for all scale-ups, is if you are a scale-up, your shares, your incentive models are extremely attractive. For a company like ours, which is IPO, they're even more attractive, right? Because shares are really liquid. But I think it also counts for scale-ups because, it's an attractive balance between strong financial reward and lower risk compared maybe to a startup, right? So I think, in Europe, we very often give not enough shares and we only give it to management. And that's something which I really learned from Sezzle, which is very common, that you give it to every employee. It's a standard there, right? That this really makes a difference. And it makes a difference on many levels. Not only that they're more incentivized to work for you because they get a financial gain, but it really builds culture and a common understanding and values and so on, right? If you are part of this company. And I think this is something which we really don't do enough in Europe. And people complain about, but the ESOPs are not tax optimized. And so, but I mean, there's always ways, right? And it's very interesting that we don't do this earlier. And I didn't do it myself, right? My last company, I didn't do shares for the entire company. We talked about it, but we never executed it. So I think this is very important. And then for me, the second thing is, if you scale fast into new countries, you really, if you have the luxury to go for AAA people, for top of the notch people, you should always try to get AAA hires, because your key hires, the country manager, whoever the head of sales per country and so on, they will have a huge impact on if this is going to be a success or not. And they also will hire, the team below them. And if you have AAA people, they're going to hire AAA people. And these people are never on the market. So you should not only rely on a recruiting agency, right? A lot of people just go to recruiting agency. They don't know really the market's a new market. And of course you should do that and you learn the tricks from the recruiting agency. But on the end of the day, good people, no matter which market you are in, are not on the market. So it's more about identifying where they are and poaching them. And this poaching really has to be done by you. You really have to kind of reach out to them. I mean, you can work with your freelancers and your HR and so on to use your LinkedIn account, for example. That's how we do it. We use the LinkedIn account and then we send them messages. But it's really you who have to sit down for coffee. If, Corona times, you can't do that, but maybe set up a call and talk to these guys and convince them. So I think that's also very, very important. And just getting back to the point on agencies, I think agencies, job postings and agencies are not the solution. But I think, personally, at least, if you go into a new market, it's always good to start with an agency, because you learn, you weigh around the market. You learn which job post works, and so on. And as soon as you have a good understanding, I rather work with my internal team in the long term, and maybe in the short to medium term, you have strong freelancers which are specialized, right? Recruiters which are specialized to help you out. But I guess these are my two biggest learnings in terms of recruiting.
And can I just follow up? You mentioned freelancers. I see a number of companies using freelancers as a first stage, consultants, people, because they haven't got ready to make the hires that they want to make permanently. Do you think that's a good way, or do you think it's worth holding out to hire full-time employees straight up?
I think it's a good way to start it, because the problem with agencies is that you never know if there's a bigger client, right? So you don't have a lot of insight or transparency how much they're really working for you. If you're a freelancer, it's kind of, a person which comes into your team, hopefully exclusively working for you, which you can use very flexible, right? And you do have initially always quite a high effort to build your initial team. And then obviously there's a time where you have maybe less stress unless you're hyperscaling or blitzscaling, right? And I think, it's good to start this way because it's easy. There are very good specialized freelancers out there. I can highly recommend Done. Yeah, some advertising here for a company that we are using. They're doing an awesome job. And for us, it's a deal to start like that, because I'm very flexible with my budget and I don't need to hire an entire HR team, which I don't initially need, right? Because we're still a family team, right? We want to, 10 people, 1 to 20 people. You don't need a fully fledged HR team for that, right? It comes maybe after you hit, your 20 people, then you really need to get the HR team in place. And the recruiters always have certain phases to go through, and hence I'm a fan of freelancers, but it's always the quality of the freelancer, right? So you need to know your way around and know the right people.
Yeah, no, I agree. Sophie.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. Everything you've both just said. There's a certain, when you're still a certain size, even though you're growing, and even though we were lucky enough that from the very beginning, actually our customers paid for our product. So we did have revenue coming in that we could grow through. And then we did a pre-seed round which supported it. But nonetheless, we were not in a place to hire the 6-7 developers that we needed in-house. And also, each sort of product development phase required different deep skills, let's say. So, we had, for example, a freelance developer from Vietnam who's like the crack in live streaming. He would have no interest to work for us full time, So, but we needed him for like 4 or 5 months for a certain phase of the product building. And now he's working for us like on a 1-day-a-week basis, right? So I think for the beginning, if you have access or you can find those experts that you need and they're willing to work for you freelance specifically for what you need, that's a great way to start. And then there's other areas, like, for example, customer success. Now that we've done such a big deployment phase, our next big focus, of course, is keeping the customer happy. So we've made a key hire someone to build a customer success team who's already built customer success teams in 2 other startups and knows how to do that and build the processes around that as well. So bit by bit, we're taking things in-house, but I think also working with freelancers is a great way to learn and understand what you really need. So I think a certain balance for a certain phase of a startup will always be there. For ways to find great people, I agree 100%. LinkedIn stalking is what I call it, and have spent quite a bit, unfortunately, but quite a bit of my time doing that and just building my network so that if I need someone, I can sort of say, okay, instantly here are these 5 people that I can maybe reach out to, that I could maybe poach. And it's just, what else do you have? There's no fairs at the moment. There's no meetups, where else am I going to go? So that definitely has been a feasible strategy for us in the past months. And also to advertise, not for an agency, but for a different startup. There's a startup called Pitch Me. And they started out first by helping, I think, about 70,000, mostly IT staff in Europe, learning sort of soft skills. They put them through training programs and whatnot. And then at some point, they developed like an HR matchmaking online platform out of it. So you could say like the Tinder for finding staff, let's say. And it's based on values. So not only are you looking for hard skills, you have like your company values profile, and it gets matched with hires that have the same values and share the same values, want to work in that kind of culture environment kind of phase that you're in. And we've tested them once or twice and had some really pretty good hit rates at a really fair price compared to an HR agency. So that's also a great place to start for a startup.
That sounds very useful. The other thing I've seen work well for teams that don't have strong financial skills is getting part-time CFOs early on, to take CFOs or finance directors who can take on some of the burden of some of the plumbing of running the business and getting numbers ready for investors at various stages, those kinds of things. I think that can work well when founders that don't have those skills. Could we talk a little bit about managing and motivating people? Because I think, as is normal, it's not just finding them and paying them. It's about actually keeping them motivated to do what you want them to do. And talking a little about culture and how you set it. Maybe, Sophie, you're nodding. Maybe you'd like to start.
Well, I think, again, since we're just sort of in a flip phase from, hardcore self-deployment modes, which we're still in, but at the same time sort of, really now focusing on customer satisfaction and keeping them happy. It's an interesting thing to have both sort of happening in parallel, and it does open some cultural discussions, right? No question. Also in terms of focus and what's the sort of North Star, what are the 3 North Star metrics you're aiming for, let's say, right? And we have, in fact, decided for next year that that's going to be customer satisfaction. Of course, we want to grow, and of course, we will keep growing. But we have decided that that's going to be customer satisfaction and customer retention. And we're now looking into how to break that down into the individual, also KPIs, goals, for the individual people in the team, so that everybody is aligned, let's say, under that North Star metric. I mean, this is not rocket science. I think a clear vision of where you're heading, clear goals that support that vision, and a very sort of clear idea of who you are in terms of values and whether the people that you hire share those values. All sounds relatively simple, I suppose. Of course, finding the people that actually match the values and that actually agree with that North Star metric and are motivated by working towards it, that's, of course, then, yeah, the tricky part.
Yeah. Maybe, Kalyo, you could talk about some of your experiences in doing that with larger teams that have been brought on board. Because I think describing it is quite simple. The doing is actually quite hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly without HR on site.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I fully agree with everything Sophie also said. I think building a culture that you really live and building values that people really live is probably the hardest thing ever, right? It's an endless battle where you constantly have to adjust. Sometimes you have to be the diplomat. Sometimes you need to act like a democrat. Sometimes you have to be a dictator, right? But it's an endless battle. But I think it's one of the most important battles, and maybe some startups don't do this early enough. So I think if you take a step back, how do you motivate people? You have extrinsic and then intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic is the whole package, shares and the whole thing, right? And I think that's important. But an intrinsic is, as Sophie already explained, it's about really building a vision and then having a mission below the vision and then having values, right, which you really do live. And, it's very, very hard to do that because visions and missions sound often very empty. And people often, if you ask them what are the values of your company, they have that written down somewhere. It's very rare that they really can tell you all of the values. So I think, mission-driven companies are probably going to be the most successful one. For example, Sezzle is an extremely mission-driven company. Our mission is to financially empower the consumer. And we're extremely focused on the consumer, despite the fact that we are a B2B company, right? And hence we have probably in the whole buy now, pay later segment, we have the highest consumer ratings across the globe, no matter where you look, right? And this is really because this is not only a mission that we live, we have not only this relentless focus on customer, but you really see that the CEO, Charlie Youakim, which I think is one of the best CEOs I've ever worked for, really lives this mission. He lives the values, right? He acts by example, and you really see this cascades down into the entire company. And I think this is very rare. At least I saw examples of how culture should not be. Rocket maybe is one of Rocket was very successful, but culture building was not one of their, fortes, so to say. Yeah? So I think, to really build culture, it is, you really have to look into it. You have to understand how you not only define the right values, but how you make them actionable, right? Mm-hmm. So for example, if one of your value is ownership, right? I would say, okay, then maybe think about OKRs, because OKRs is a great tool and process and structure to give ownership to, the intern up to the CEO. Everybody's ownership, that also fosters transparency, by the way. A lot of people have transparency as a value, right? So how do you are transparent? What does transparency mean? Does it mean that I'm going to sit down in an all hands and we do questions, which are anonymous questions and everybody can ask whatever they want and I have to give feedback, or maybe if I don't want to give feedback, have to say, sorry, I'm not going to answer this question in front of the entire company, right? So it's really about thinking, what's your vision? What's your mission? How do you live this mission? What the values are below it? And how do you make them actionable, right? It's not enough just to write them down. You need to make them, to take this value and put it into a process and say, this process is representing this value. Right, and then people really, dig it and live it. But there's
Could you give me an example of one of those.
For example, I'm a big supporter of OKRs, right? Because OKRs does a lot of things which are really important to me. It fosters transparency, it fosters ownership, and it fosters also a lot of communication. Right, all values which we have, ownership, transparent communication, because OKRs essentially force you to do cross-departmental discussion because you're dependent on departments which are, on the same kind of, reporting level, right? You have to talk to IT to see, hey, my goals realistic. IT, are you actually providing me that? Yeah, we do. HR, can you actually get me the salespeople so I can, and so on. So that's one thing to do it, right? What else is there? 360-degree feedback sessions, right? Also another tool which is quite powerful, yeah. Where you get a lot of feedback, from people who work above you, below you, on the same level as you, right? So there are different things, and I think again, less is more. Really looking at certain, for example, OKRs or 360 feedback sessions are extremely difficult to implement in any company in a way that really brings results, because there's always the initial phase. There's always a phase where you have opportunity costs, right? You need to implement it. People are not happy with it. Things are changing. There are always people who are against change, right? And then it takes 2, 3, 4 quarters until you really see the result and people live it, So you really need to think very carefully about what you implement and how this represents your values and your vision and your mission.
Okay. Thank you.
I agree. We also work with OKRs. I'm not going to lie, when the sudden growth hit, quite a lot of stuff went out the window. And now we're pulling all those strings together and trying to be really diligent. And now that we are building a team, and it's not just the small sort of founding team where we were also locked up together in one living room together. So, I mean, everybody knew what the other one was doing. Everyone could hear everybody's phone calls. But now as we're growing, exactly bringing us back to sort of those North Star metrics, those guiding principles, those values, is absolutely necessary. And actually, we've just started working with Asana. We already use it for customer onboardings. So our sales team is working with it quite a lot. And they've just released an OKR planning feature. So you can actually do top-down OKR planning, that you can, the independent teams that are on the tool, you can give them the access to their goals, and then they can follow their progress in the individual projects or whatever they're working on, even product development. And then it ties right back into the tool, and you can see exactly what the progress is, and everybody can see everybody else's progress as well. And it's quite
very nice.
It's, I mean,
transparent.
I don't know. I think my team is no more tools and no more features and Sophie. But it's super helpful because everybody understands their piece of the puzzle and how it integrates into the rest and why it's important. And also, Caio, I fully agree with you. Actually, our first mission is to create and design the most joyful, intuitive, and seamless live commerce experiences. So we always have the end user in mind with every sort of decision that we make, right? And everything. That's our primary mission, right? And then, yes, the retailers, the e-com players, the brands that we work with, that's the B2B element to it, right? But I absolutely agree with you. It's the people we're empowering at the very end, let's say, that are actually using this on a daily basis, that we primarily have in mind when we design or think of the future. It also makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of B2B SaaS companies find that difficult and maybe prioritize their B2B customers over the end user, which ultimately probably will not lead to success, because it's the end user that needs to accept the solution or use the solution or whatever, right? So they need to be happy with it, and they need to give the retailer or the brand the feedback that they love it, like your solution, like Sezzle, right? And then they will start loving it too.
Yeah, I fully agree. And you see this also with double-sided marketplace or platform solutions. There's a lot of confusion. Who's the king, right? A lot of people say, is it the supply side or demand side, right? And they never went to the point to really decide who's the king and who they're going to build for, right? So it's always a mix, and that's never smart, right? You need to make the decision, who's my king? And then you need to cater to this guy and have a laser focus on that guy.
Just taking some of the questions that have come in, I have a couple of specifics, one for each of you. Maybe starting with Caio. For BNPL purposes, do you prioritize integration through e-commerce platforms such as Shopify and Magento, or direct integration through APIs?
So it depends on which type of merchant you are talking to. So if you talk about SMB merchants, we go for e-commerce platforms because it's much more scalable. If you talk to big key accounts, you go into direct integrations because most of the big key accounts have in-house solutions. So it's changing now a little bit, but yeah, so depending if it's SMB or key accounts.
Okay. And Sophie, for you, what was your live shopping MVP, what were the features you started with?
Live streaming, group chat, and the ability to buy the products. That's it. And today, we've literally just last week released from the outside view an additional feature, which is a co-host feature, so that two people can co-moderate a live shopping show together, being in two locations, which is something we prioritized in development given the current situation, so that our brands that were doing shows with two, for example, beauty experts doing tutorials together in one place, that they could keep doing that even if they were in two places. So, and we've kept it that simple until now. Of course, in the back end, we've optimized God knows how many things about the chat features, that there's like a profanity filter that you can block users, that, you know, there's all this stuff happening in the back end. But in the front, it's really that simple. And only for next year, as to the topic we had before with innovation, are we really looking into really exciting stuff like gamifying the experience and doing all these other things, which will be super fun. But, you know, the fundamentals, and also to prove that this works, that was what we had to focus on first. And then all the other things will add to the engagement and the fun of the experience in the future.
Okay, thank you. A couple of different questions. We've talked earlier about scaling sort of generically, but perhaps being specific in a different way. When you decide to go international or to go into market A versus market B when you're leaving your home market, is that a sequential process? I mean, do you start international and just plug in the gaps randomly? Do you, build at home and then start in a new market as your first adventure? Maybe you could both talk a little bit about that. Maybe Carlo, you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think, it's situational, right? There's no kind of answer which applies to all situations. But I think, what I would always say, if you have a proven concept in your market and you scale it in your market, then and you have markets surrounding you which are very similar from the market setup and the social demographics and so on, right, and needs, then it's probably a better idea to internationalize than to kind of vertically or horizontally expand, right, by building new innovative features or new services and so on, right? Because in my opinion, and I think this is, maybe a lot of people disagree with that approach, but in my opinion, it's easier to get into a new market with a proven model than to out-innovate an existing market with something new, right? So if you're at the point where you say, listen, this works now, and we kind of tweaked it, and we now essentially have to vertical integrate in our home market, then it's time to move into the next market. But you obviously have to afford that, right? It costs money, right? So my take is, as soon as you prove of concept, and you can convince your investors to put a lot of money into you because they trust you, you should expand rather sooner than later, right? Because most businesses are dominated by size, right? And there's always going to be one dominant player. I mean, there are some markets which are super fragmented, where this is not the situation, but these are also not the most attractive markets. Those markets which are really attractive, there's always going to be one big guy, right? And I think very often in Europe, we don't think big enough. And we think about, how to exit it in 4 years or something like that. But if you look at all the American big players, they really understood it. The blitz scaling very, very early on is extremely important, right? And they'll go for different motions, but the internationalization approach is one very systematic approach. And they do it for everything that is proven in the home market. There's always the same steps, right? The American companies always go into the Anglo-Saxon room, and then they go into the Western European room, and then kind of Asia and so on, right? So they always go for the same motions. And I think, startups need to think maybe a little earlier about expansion than doing this too late. So you can't be too early. It's a question, can you afford it? Well, you can be too early. So that's the last sentence is bad. You can be too early, but you certainly more often are too late, right?
Yeah.
I hope this answers the question. It was maybe a little flaky.
I think so.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard unless you're really specific, because a lot of it is quite generic, and often individual business models make it more specific. But I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So I think here again, what helps is if you want to be very specific, then have a plan from the outset. I need to hit PMF. PMF are those KPIs, those metrics. Those are PMF. Then I need to scale. I need to get to the point where I scale, I don't know, 10x, right? Or I have an indication that I can do that. If I hit the indication, then it's time to expand, internationalize, right? So you can have a plan from the outside, which is very clearly just executing the points, right? And ideally you have investors which understand that and say, okay, let's do it. It's easier for second-time founders, at least in Europe, because they did it already, so they're going to do it again. But yeah, so you certainly can work with very specific goals, which are very metric-driven, to make this clearer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and from my side, I think if you would have asked me a year ago, I probably would have shared a relatively classic idea on this, that maybe you need to prove in certain sort of home markets first that it works, and only then, because you need the setup, because you need to put a muscle behind it, does it make sense to expand. And I think COVID also comes into play here, at least for what we do. So we're retail tech, B2B SaaS, a digital product. A year ago, meeting companies, big companies like the ones we work with, usually those companies would have required at least one of us to actually be there and pitch to them in person, right? It's a CIO or a CDO or the innovation team or the CMO. Somebody would have been like, hey, if we want to start doing live shopping, it's quite an innovative thing. I want one of the Lisa team to be here and like to pitch this to me in person. So, we'd be flying around, and at the time only Europe, to pitch like for 1 hour to a potential customer. And I mean, the cost that incurred and also the time it took was like insane. But of course you do it because you need to get your foot in the door, right? And then COVID hit, and there was suddenly a very high demand for what we do. And there was simply no other way than to meet, online to explain and demo the product once or twice, and then for there to be a decision, do they want to do live shopping, yes or no? And for us to start the onboarding process and get on with it. And since March, every single customer we've onboarded has been 100% digital. And at this point in time, it doesn't matter whether it's the US or, we're looking into Korea right now. It just doesn't matter. The only difference, and that's the one thing we're looking into for next year, is that we might start building small customer support teams on the ground of those countries which we've already expanded into, simply for time zone purposes. So if an American brand is live, it's like 2 o'clock at night here. And as much as I'm sure our team loves us, I'm sure at some point they're going to kill us if we keep asking them to support the customers at 2 at night. Of course, it's us founders that then mostly do that. So for sure, there will be the requirement to build 1 or 2, let's say, support people in the geographies that our customers are in for pure time zone reasons. But other than that, the customer acquisition, the customer onboarding, all of that, the deployment of the product, all works digitally. So I think that has had a massive impact on the considerations of how to internationalize. And they are very different than they were a year ago, for us at least.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything Sophie said. We experienced similar situation now.
Me too. That's what I see too. I'm conscious of time and that we probably need to bring this to a close. I think that my last question for you is, when do you think we're going to go back to being required to show up in person? Mm-hmm. Because it's been a great advantage. I think, Sophie, you've talked about it for your business, but I see it across lots of businesses that sales has become much easier in some respects when you don't have to travel. It's a bit more complicated on an interpersonal level. But I already see people starting to plan when they can go back to visiting people. And I just wondered how you both were thinking about that.
I guess it's, I don't think it's going to go back to what it used to be before Corona, right? I mean, if you think about it, I used to travel 3 times a week or something. I used to travel sometimes 10 hours a day for a 2-hour meeting, 1-hour meeting where I said maybe 5 sentences, right? It wasn't actually inside, it was so bizarre, right? And a charge for that as well, right? So, people paid me for that,
totally.
Sitting in a taxi and in a plane and so on. So I don't think it's going to go back to that, but I think, it needs to be the right balance, right? So I also see a lot of people. There's some people which thrive on remote work. Other people have a real problem with it, right? They're very isolated, They consider their teammates often their family, right? It's very important for them to have the social interactions. So I think what's going to happen is, at least that's what we are planning, is there is going to be a very flexible model, right? For example, we are in the moment planning to set up teams that have access to the WeWorks of this world, right? Where they can come, but they don't have to come, right? We have certain rooms which are dedicated to us for more sensitive teams like finance and HR and so on, right? We rent out bigger rooms if we do an all hands, and there are certain days where everybody meets for cultural building situation and so on and so forth, right? And I think, certain deals, certain meetings have to be done face to face, right? If you have a really important deal or you get a very important investor, you might want to meet him and shake his hand, right? But I do expect that this is going to be very different, even if Corona is completely gone. And at least we are planning according to that. In the moment, the advantages certainly outweigh the disadvantages. And a year ago, I was actually imposed to that. So I had loads of discussions in the last years, really, about going more remote, and I was always against it, and so on. And I just realized I was completely wrong, right? It's just, as long as you keep the same time zone. I mean, we have people employed from Ukraine to South Africa, right? As long as it's in the same time zone, it works, and it just, increases the recruitment pool so massively, right? And yeah, overall, I think there's a lot of advantages, but we need to get the right balances, and we really need to kind of do some A/B testing and do some cycles until it works to the point that we really want to have it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I don't, to be honest, I think for the type of product that we have, and because it can be started with such light integration for the brands, it's easy for them to, even if they're paying for it, but just to start testing it. I think the mindset has shifted, do I have to really have that startup come pitch to me in person if this is sort of what the pricing is and how easy it is to set up, so I think there is a sense that it's changed. And for sure, if we start like expanding with a customer and we start integrating, for some we're starting to integrate in-app, after a successful pilot period and whatnot, there I think it can make sense then after, a successful trial together or whatever, to sit down and actually meet the people on the other end of the screen. But I hope it doesn't become a sort of hard demand again.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you both. It's been really interesting. I hope our audience found it useful, but it's been very generous of you to share your insights with everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
I can add to that, Sophie. Those were lovely questions, Johanna. Thank you so much for preparing that. It really brought out some good conversations, good sharings. Looking at both, or like all three of you. I wish I could share this with even more people. I'm glad that this will be somewhere on YouTube so that people can rewatch this and learn, because really, really great takeaways. Also, just on, I'm thinking about the hard skills and the soft skills that you mentioned and like your experience. So thank you very much for your time.